If you like the bedtime story, give it a thumbs up, and feel free to leave any comments below. You can comment about the story, you can comment saying what other ideas, like story ideas, you have that you'd like to see me do. And if you're not already, subscribe to the channel. I post videos weekly, and click the bell icon, and that way you'll get notified when my videos go live. So I hope you enjoy this story. So take a moment to let your eyes close and allow yourself to begin to comfortably drift asleep. And as you begin to comfortably drift off asleep, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster with the sound of my voice or with the words that I'm using, or whether you'll find yourself drifting faster with the spaces between my words. And as you begin to drift comfortably asleep, you can listen to me tell this story in the background. And one day, a man is out on an adventure. He's gone on a safari, and he's out in Africa on a big 4x4. And he's got his camera, and he's scanning the horizon. He's looking for lions. He's zooming in on the zebra. He's seeing what he can see with his camera. And then the 4x4 drives on a little bit and will stop somewhere else on this savanna. And he looks around, he takes a few more photos. And then it moves somewhere else, and they get a different perspective, seeing different animals. And he can notice the colour of the sky, and how that contrasts with the colour of the ground in the savannah. How much browns there are in this savannah, while there's also pockets of greens and other colours. And there's the occasional pool of water, making a striking blue area within the savannah. And when he looks through his camera, looks through the eyepiece, and he zooms in on something, he can't hear it, but he can see it moving and walking and feeding. And while he's watching the animals, he feels like he's somewhere else, some time else, where there's no sounds of what he's seeing. It just feels like he's there with them, in the same way that when you look through a telescope at night time and you look up at Saturn, and you're in the pitch black, and all you can see is what you can see through the eyepiece. And you can see Saturn moving slowly across the view that you're looking at. And you almost feel like you're floating in space, just a little distance from Saturn. And the first time someone does that can be a really profound experience. And then as the sun begins to set on the savannah, so the light begins to change. Shadows begin to stretch across the ground. Contrast increases. And a certain orange hue takes on the environment. And he takes plenty of photos. At this time when the sun is setting, when the animals are beginning to settle down for the night. When the light is just perfect for photography. And after the sun has set, and there's no lights anywhere, he gazes up and sees the most beautiful, magnificent night sky, arcing overhead, sees the way the Milky Way stretches across the sky. He takes some photos of the sky before they all get back into this 4x4 and head back to the camp. And back at the camp, he goes to his room, goes out on the balcony out the back of the room, and he can hear the nighttime sounds of the savanna. He can feel the gentle breeze on his face. While he sits there at a table with his camera, reviewing the photos he'd spent the day taking. And as he sat there reviewing the photos, so his mind began to wander. And while his mind began to wander, he began to wonder. He wondered what it would be like to be living here, nomadically, to be living out on that savanna, where every night you're greeted with that glorious space view. Every day you feel the warmth of the day. You see animals going about their daily life. And he wondered and wondered about what that must be like. And he just sat in that chair, relaxing, letting his mind drift and wander, as his fingers clicked through the photos, while he was just gazing into space. And after going through the photos and doing some wondering, he went to bed, settled down looking forward to the next day, and drifted comfortably asleep. And while he drifted comfortably asleep, he started to dream about himself, living out on a savanna, and he had a pet wolf that was a companion, that came on his journeys with him, kept him company. He started to dream about the adventures that him and his pet wolf would have. Of going hunting to catch food, of sitting by a river for hours and hours, relaxing and fishing just to catch a fish for dinner. Of building his own camps and shelter. And he became absorbed in the dream. And while he became absorbed in the dream, he started to have a sense that in this dream, this time period, was going back just a couple of 100 years. And he could see, cutting across the savanna, was a railway track with an old steam train traversing the savanna with ornate wooden carriages, people dressed smart old clothes. And he watched as the train passed by, and he saw in the distance a train station, and he decided that he would go and check out this train station. So him and the wolf made the journey along the edge of the train track, following that train track towards the train station. And as they walked, he could hear the sounds of his footsteps. He could feel the slight breeze on his face and the warmth of the sun, and hear the panting of the wolf. And he followed that track towards the train station. And as he got closer to the train station, so he noticed how basic the station was. And there was no one there, just a train station in the middle of nowhere. There was no sign saying the name of the station. There was no roads leading to or from the station. Just a station in the middle of nowhere. And he walked up onto the wooden boards of the station, noticing how his footsteps sounded different as he walked from solid mud up wooden steps onto a wooden platform. And he walked into the shade on the wooden platform and sat down on a bench. And the wolf came and sat beside him. And the two of them just sat and waited. And while they sat there waiting, he reached over and started petting the wolf, scratching just behind the wolf's ear, stroking the side of its neck. And the wolf gently rested its head against the man's leg. And as the sun travelled across the sky, the man just waited. He didn't know where the trains came from, where the trains went, but he was curious to find out. So he just waited and waited. And after some time, he could see in the distance some steam on the horizon. And a little bit longer he could see a train appear on the horizon. And he watched as that train got nearer and nearer to the station. He stood up, he walked over towards the track and waited near the track as the train noisily pulled in, let off some steam, and came to a halt. and he climbed up some steps and into a carriage. And he noticed there were other people talking among themselves on the train. And he sat down in a window seat. And the wolf lay down on the floor by his feet under the table. And the train jolted to a start, slowly at first, and then picking up speed as it left the station. And the man was curious where the train's going to go. And as the train left the station, it picked up speed, getting faster, noticing the increasing speed of the clickety-clack of the track, watching the outside world go by. And then suddenly there was a blue flash, and a bright light, and then darkness, all outside the train. And yet the train felt no different. It seemed to still be going at the same speed. It was making the same sounds. There was no jolt. There was nothing on the train that would lead anyone to think that anything had happened. And yet outside the window now were lights, almost like points of lights or stars. There was no longer any savanna. In any direction, whatever window he looked out of, there was just lights. And then the train seemed to be speeding up, and the lights nearer to the train began to look more like streaks. And the man was confused, and yet the wolf lay on the floor, perfectly calm and perfectly comfortable with the experience. So the man trusted that the experience was fine, was safe, which led to an intense curiosity to discover what's occurring, where this is. And then the train began to lean slightly, as if it was turning. And as it did, the man noticed out of the window on the opposite side that there appeared to be a planet, like although the train was making sounds like it was on a track, it now seemed like it was in space. And the train began to circle that planet. And the man didn't know what to make of this, how you're supposed to leave the train, what's supposed to be occurring. And he gazed down at that planet below, and none of the other passengers on the train seemed remotely fazed by this. And then a guard walked down the centre of the train, asking anyone who's getting off at this stop to follow him. And the man didn't know what that meant. How can you get off when you're in space? But he thought he's here on an adventure. He's curious, so you may as well try and find out what's going on. So he followed the guard down the train. And the guard ushered the man, his wolf, and a few others into what just looked like a carriage at the back of the train. And he walked into that carriage, sat down against the wall, put on a seatbelt. The door was closed. There was a psst sound as air or a separation happened between the carriage and the rest of the train. And then there was silence. And the man had this vague sense of movement, vague sense that the carriage was moving. And he could see out the back of the carriage a small little square window. And he could see through that window, and he noticed the carriage began to face towards the planet and just seemed to float easily, calmly and effortlessly towards that planet. And then as it got nearer to the planet, the carriage began to shake and vibrate slightly. He could see red light at that window. And then after a few minutes, the red light cleared, the vibration stopped, and he could see the ground beneath him. And then after a few more minutes, he heard a thud as the carriage rumbled slightly, and he could see through that window that it had landed on the ground. And he took the seatbelt off just as someone was opening the door to the carriage. And he walked out of the door. The wolf followed him, and he was dazzled by the bright light of the day. He looked up into the sky to try and see the rest of the train. He tried to work out where he was. Nothing looked familiar. It all had a vague sense of familiarity, in that plants were green, mud was brown, the sky was blue, but none of the plants were familiar plants. None of the view was a familiar view. And strangely, as he turned and looked back at the carriage he'd just exited, it was on a railway track. Somehow this railway carriage had entered space, had detached from a train, had dropped into the atmosphere of a planet and landed directly on a train track. And he thought to himself how impressive that is, to be able to land an object like that on two rails on the ground from space. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, what he was allowed to do, but he decided to go exploring. So him and the wolf, they went off, had a bit of a wander. And they could see off in the distance was a river. So they walked over to that river. And they looked around and they could see the way the sun for this planet looked in the sky, that it seemed to have a slightly oranger tint to it. And that was making the blue of the river water have a slight orange glow to its surface. And they reached the river, and the man put his hand down. He wanted to feel the water. He put his hand down, he rested his fingertips into the water, and you could feel that cool flowing water passing through his fingertips. He could hear the bubbling of the water as it flowed downstream. He could see animals he'd never seen before, drinking from the river. And strange fish he'd never seen before, swimming in the river. And he followed the river all the way down to a lake. And as he got down by the lake, it was starting to get late. So he decided he needed to build himself a shelter for the night. And he was curious whether he could build himself a shelter on the lake. So he went collecting some wood from the woodland. He collected long bits of grass. He peeled off strips of bark from some of the wood. He wrapped it all together and put it all together and created a raft. Then he created a tent shape out of wood, and he placed that on top of the raft. And then he bound the two together. And then he went and found some large, broad leaves. He placed them over the top of the tent, and using the strips of bark, he weaved them all together. He found some moss and leaves and other soft material that he placed inside his tent on the raft. And he had a small area of the raft that the tent didn't cover. And he got some stones and he placed them around in a circle, gradually moving to the centre of that circle. And then he made himself a little fire. He knew that there was a risk that it could possibly burn through to the bottom, burn through to the wood underneath it. But he'd left an air gap, And he was confident that the way he'd made the fire, that it wouldn't get through to the raft itself, and if it did, he could just knock it into the water and it would be fine. He then moved the raft out onto the water to see if it would float. Pushed it out onto the water. The wolf helped by pulling on the raft. They got it out into the water and it floated. And he climbed into it. The wolf climbed in next to him. The raft tent bobbed up and down a little bit. He used some vines that he'd found around the trees to attach the raft to a stake that he left on the shore, so that it could move out from the shore a little way but was still attached to that point on the shore. He lit the fire and cooked up some fish. And relaxed down for the night in that raft. And as he relaxed, he closed his eyes. He could feel the gentle bobbing motion of the raft boat, of the raft tent on that water. He could hear different night sounds of different animals at night. He could see what the night sky looked like here, and how it was different to the night sky on Earth. And he began to drift off asleep, with the warmth of the wolf lying next to him. And while he drifted off asleep, he began to feel this deep sense of serenity, of peace, of calmness, a deep connection with the environment, with the world around him, like he was one with the world. And as he relaxed deeper into the experience, all he could see in his mind's eye was blackness. And then he began to hear footsteps, like footsteps echoing in a stone chamber. And gradually, a stone palace began to appear around him as the darkness began to disappear. And as the darkness began to disappear and this stone palace appeared around him, he realized the footsteps were his own and that he was walking through this palace. And he looked up, he looked around to see how grand it was. The colour of the stone on the walls, on the floor, the echoey sound of each footstep. He touched some of the stone pillars to notice how polished they were and smooth. And he walked towards someone sat in a seat. And as he got near them, they rose and walked down some steps towards him. And they started telling him about some secret knowledge and a secret library underneath this palace. And they walked around and down some steps, and he followed them. And he walked with them down the spiral stairs, underneath the palace, where he saw mile upon mile of books in an underground library. He was told that all the knowledge of the universe is contained somewhere within all these books. And the knowledge you seek, you shall find here. And he didn't know he was seeking knowledge, yet he did know. His curiosity has driven him to continue exploring into the unknown. And he walked down the different aisles of books. He could smell those books. Until he found a book that seemed to resonate with him. He didn't know what it was about the cover that made the book resonate, but it somehow resonated. He picked the book off the shelf, was surprised to find he could understand the writing, despite its ancient look, and despite the fact that it's on an alien planet. He found himself effortlessly reading through that book, and effortlessly absorbing that knowledge and wisdom from the book. It talked to him about pretending, and that pretending is the key to everything. And he didn't fully understand this, but it talked about pretending is the key to success. And after reading the book, he walked around and read another book and another book, until eventually he decided it was time to make the journey home. And he journeyed back out of the library, up the spiral staircase, back into that palace room where his footsteps echoed as he saw that person sat on the chair. He then walked away, across the stone, echoing his way out of the palace. And strangely the palace seemed to lead into darkness, and he kept walking as the palace began to fade and darkness set in, until all he could do was hear his footsteps. And then after a while, his footsteps faded, and he woke up in that tent, floating on the lake, relaxing, with the wolf sleeping beside him. And he saw the sun on this planet rising, heard the change in animal sounds as a new day set in. He pulled himself back to the shore, and the two of them walked back, following the river, and then heading back in the direction of that train carriage. And as they approached the train carriage, he was surprised to see that the carriage was now just one of many carriages on a train on the track. And he went to the platform and he climbed on the train. And he sat down on the train and then heard a whistle sound as that train jolted to a start. Started along the track, picking up speed, getting faster and faster, chugging along, the clickety-clack getting faster and faster, the scenery flashing by, faster and faster. Then there was a dazzling light, and then blackness and stars. And yet the clickety-clack sound continued. Everything on the train continued as if nothing had changed. And yet his experience told him he must now be back in space, leaving that planet. And he watched out the windows as all the stars flashed by, turning to streaks, getting faster and faster. Before getting that feeling of the train turning again, and then looking out the window and seeing the earth below. And then, like before, a guard walked down the centre of the train, saying, "Anyone who's getting off here, follow him." And he followed the guard to the back of the train, into the carriage at the back of the train. He strapped himself in. He heard the carriage detach from the train. He could see through the small window in the back that the carriage was heading down towards the earth. It rumbled through the atmosphere. Before landing on earth, and the door opening, and he exited the train. And he saw that it was back on the track, almost at the point where he'd got on it. And the man and the wolf left the carriage, looked around and took in the familiarity, the feeling of walking back on earth again. And started making their way back across the savanna. And after a little while of them making their way back across the savanna, the man on his safari began to drift deeper and deeper asleep beyond the dream. He began to drift into a deep recuperative sleep, where his mind and body would heal itself, make all the necessary changes from the day for the future, integrating all learning, all inner wisdom, all the insights gained from the day and from the experiences, and learning from the dream. And the man drifted deeper and more comfortably asleep. Aware that at some point in the morning he was going to go on another safari adventure, and would probably lead to more dreams, more strange tales at night, to help him relax, sleep, and reprogram his mind to be the person he's becoming. And with a smile, he drifted to sleep into a deep and comfortable, relaxing sleep.